Greetings, everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to CDO to CEO, the path to leading a nonprofit. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell & Company webinars. So to ensure that you have the best webinar experience possible, please follow these tips. So first, close any programs other than GoToWebinar, of course, that are running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. You can move your cell phone away from your computer, and if you experience any visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company. You may also contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. Finally, today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you will earn 1 continuing education credit. That's good for participation with CFRE International. About an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinars that includes a web address to download your certificate and the PDF of the presentation. And now I'd like to hand it over to Marion. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to CDO to CEO, the road to the top. I'm joined today by my colleague, Patty Toomey, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. Sorry about the operating. And I'd like to ask Patty to give a little bit of background about herself, and I will also do the same. And then we'll be right into it. We hope that you enjoyed today's experiences as much as we have putting it together for you, and we hope that there's a lively conversation coming out of it. So, Patty, I'm happy that you're here. Thank you for joining us, and will you let us know something about you?
I will. Marion, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. Actually, when I started at the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation about 6.5 years ago, I did start as a Chief Operating Officer, and soon thereafter became President because much of what I did was externally focused. Most recently, for the last few years, I've served as President and CEO. My background is actually in education and the arts, and so I have held positions at the Field Museum, the School of the Art Institute, the Peggy Note About Nature Museum. I've also had the wonderful opportunity to be an instructor at the School of the Art Institute as well as Northwestern. So what I am going to do in the next couple months is leave my position at the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, and I have accepted a new position at St. Josephinum, or the Joe, as we like to call it, as a girls' high school that is part of the Sacred Heart Network. It's located on the near west side of Chicago in Wicker Park, and it has a terrific group of girls that are studying both in an IB program, theater, arts, science. So I'll be starting there in April, and very excited about that, and very excited about being with you all today.
Patty, thank you. I'm Marion Alexander DeBerry. I am the Director of Executive Search for Campbell & Company. I've been here at Campbell & Company just about 11 years. Prior to that, I was in financial services and worked for 2 commercial banks, one here and the other in Boston. This is my 3rd career. So my first was I am a former Upward Bound Director at Drexel University in Philadelphia, pre-college, first-generation city kids. I have enjoyed all of the careers, and I look forward to our work together today. So with that, let's just take it away and get started. What we're covering today is what we believe are the experiences that are necessary to become a strong and effective CEO. And we are using the terms CEO, Executive Director, and President interchangeably, understanding that it depends on the size and scale of the organization or institution that we're talking about, but understand that in this context, you may hear all 3 of those terms. We also would like to talk about overcoming the challenges and the perceptions that you may have as a Chief Development Officer or as a Senior Development Leader who is aspiring to be a CDO and perhaps at some point in your career being a CEO. And we also will talk about the expectation that the organization places on you before you become the CEO and after you have actually been there. And then finally, we'd like to talk about how organizations can reframe their own thinking about how, excuse me, can reframe their own thinking about how they evaluate whether or not someone is viable for the organization, particularly if they have been a chief development officer or a senior development leader.
Yeah, I think, Marion, as we were going through the content, one of the things that we felt both of us could bring to the process and the discussion today was actually looking at the process. So, Marion, you have a real interesting observation or lens on what a search firm can do in kind of framing a search committee's thoughts about what are they looking for and how does that fit within the culture of their organization. You know, having been a recent candidate and having to hire as well, you know, I try to take a look at who are the decision makers and who are the constants and what exactly are we looking for in whatever role we're taking, and how does that mesh with an ultimate fit.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that, you know, various lenses and points of conversation today could kind of explore that topic.
So we're going to begin with a poll, and we'd like to get some information from you that will help shape the discussion and frame what we're trying to do today. You should see on your screens.
All right. We are live with the first poll.
The poll has opened, and the question that you should see is, are you currently in a development role? And we'll give you a few seconds to be able to respond to that. And the second poll, of those of you who are in development, how many aspire to the head of the organization role? And once again, we'll give you a few seconds.
And don't be bashful. We're not going to, this is just something for us to be able to gauge the participants.
And who's here. Okay.
Right.
So the poll is closing. And we should have the results of the poll shortly.
Here we go.
And we have the results. Yes, 80% of you are currently in a development role, and 20% of you are not. And of those of you who are in a development role, close to 80%, 78% aspire to be the CEO.
Aspirational people.
Yeah, very. And 8% say no, and then 15% say not applicable. So we could make some assumptions about the not applicable, meaning that you may be on boards, you may be on search committees, or you've wandered into the wrong space. But we'll think that that's probably not true. So working forward then, background. I found this statistic kind of astonishing, frankly, but in the next 19 years, 10,000 baby boomers a day will retire. I didn't think there were that many baby boomers. But this is across all sectors, so we should, shape that a little. That includes the private sector, the public sector, as well as the nonprofit sectors. But for the next 19 years, we know that there will be a lot of retirements and people who will decide to do different things. And what's interesting in the face of that is that organizations also have had not strong transition or succession plans. We could spend lots of time talking about why that is, but that's also a reality. So there is a lot of opportunity here to be able to shape what that discussion and what that future may look like. And then the last piece of it is that fundraising is a substantial requirement to becoming heads of organization, and this is why we're calling this the road to the top. It has been our experience that in every search that we have done in the past 10 years for a head, fundraising has been number 1, number 2, or number 3 as a major requirement for attaining that position.
So I think that speaks well for 80% of you who are interested in becoming a head. But I really couldn't agree more, and it is something that we'll get into as we move on. But I think that speaks volumes, that every single search that you have done for the last 10 years has some philanthropic, external-facing requirement around the fundraising.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it really is one of the 3. It is not, well, it would be nice to have, and
It's a have-to-have.
It's a have-to-have.
Yeah,
it really is a have-to-have. And so when we look at that, if someone has to have had fundraising, then we should look at the CDO's experience and say, what is it about that experience that makes it compelling as you become the head of an organization? And obviously one of them is to raise money and to implement a philanthropic strategy and to manage and direct and develop the work of fundraisers that are around them. So I'm going to kick it over to Patty for a minute or so, and because she also has an interesting aspect about it of how it also ties into relationship building.
Right. When I started out in development, I started probably like many of us, where I would be responsible for certain donors or events or whatnot. Very quickly, I realized that my success was going to be not just in securing and soliciting, but also fulfilling and stewarding. So a lot of that depended upon my relationships, both internally and externally. Internally, because as they say, you're only as good as your team, and you have to make sure that what you are saying you're actually going to fulfill on. I also realized that it was my responsibility to make sure that my head was properly briefed and felt very comfortable, or if they did not, that I was going to be there, or one of our team members was going to be there to support them in making the gift and the request. So there was a lot of relationship building, both internally and externally, that I realized really was built into heading development, as I'm sure many of you have realized. I think the other thing is you quickly realize that you are a public face, and within your organization and externally, and how do you make sure that your messaging is consistent so that you are representing in the best way possible. So it's just, I guess, as far as I was concerned, as I grew in my career and took on more development responsibilities, I also realized that so much of my success was the team's success across the foundation or across an organization that I ultimately leveraged to move on to a head of an organization.
Now, Patty, when you decided that you were going to become a CEO, though, was that in the back of your mind when you started as a fundraiser, or did you not really have that in mind that you would head an organization one day?
Well, that's such a great question. I wish I could say I was as aspirational and ambitious, but I actually don't think I thought about that until maybe the last 10 years. When I started out in my career, I wanted to get a great mentor or mentors. I wanted to be a sponge. I wanted to take advantage of as many opportunities as possible. And admittedly, for all of us who do fundraising, I felt like at some point I needed to dabble a little bit in programs so that I understood what exactly we were representing and trying to raise money for. I actually, when I was over at the Field Museum, was responsible for streamlining financial operations. So they felt, well, if she knows the front of the house, she can figure out the back of the house as well, which was an experience that was completely invaluable. To this day, as I transitioned into a CEO role, I realized that the power was in the numbers, so that I knew what we were going out and securing from a development standpoint, but then also I could speak to how we were stewarding it on the back end. So I think as I was gaining experience, I felt more confident and comfortable in myself and what I was gaining, as well as kind of having a mentor to be able to have truthful exchanges. What exactly, if I was going to move up in my career, what would that look like?
So is it fair to say that you were inadvertently creating a CEO opportunity for yourself without realizing it?
I think so. I think that's fair. I think that's completely fair. And, I'm not sure that I did it the traditional way, but I definitely had a lot of experience across an organization that did ultimately prepare me to take a CEO role.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk more about the things that CDOs do, we have to talk about capital campaigns, because increasingly they certainly become part of the organization's repertoire at some point, and it falls to the CEO and CDO to think about that. And then we talk about partnering for specific gifts because as the CEO, they certainly need the CDO for significant opportunities. But as we all know, big donors want to talk to the head.
They do. They do. And a lot of what I do is work out relationships and ultimately securing gifts. And I will also qualify this, especially now in the climate that we're at. A lot of these relationships come through the contributed side of the house, but some of them also can be termed as earned income. And so that also is important as we're raising money, depending on who that funding source is. Is it coming through a marketing or a commercial side? Is it coming through a philanthropic side? Or could we actually have it as fee for service? So I think being a development officer, being aware of those different ways that money can come into an organization is invaluable. And then once you do have a CEO role, you can understand what best will support the financial impact and mission of your organization.
Nice. And then finally, of course, part of the CDO experience is working with board and with other volunteers to help them around their own development and pieces.
Right. And I think this is what I was speaking about earlier with being an external face. Sometimes, depending on your scope of your organization, you may have 10 volunteers, you may have hundreds of volunteers or thousands even. And so how do you measure your time as the head of development, or measure your time as the head of as a CEO or a head of an organization? How are you able to build those relationships and make sure that they are productive? And also, it's a two-way street. You want somebody to feel like they are actually doing something meaningful for your organization.
Okay. So we've got another poll. We've got another question we'd like to ask you. It's coming up now. The poll is open, and the question is, how many of you will be hiring a CEO in the next 12 months? I'll take a liberty here, even if it's beyond 12 months. If it's 12 to 24 months, let us know. We'd like to know that. And I think we can close the poll now. Everyone should have had a chance to respond. And the results are 16 of you will be hiring a CEO, and the other 84% will not be in the next 12 months. And again, there's a little bit of flexibility at 12 to 24 months. So thank you. That's really helpful for us. We want to take a look at what makes a good CEO. Certainly, it's someone who is able to create a workable vision, working with everyone both at the board and volunteer level, as well as staff level, as well as constituents and friends outside the organization, and to set an implementable strategy, but also to help set the organization's direction. So again, I have a question for Patty here. When you became the CEO, what was your biggest adjustment from being primarily responsible for fundraising to being responsible for the entire organization?
Well, you asked me earlier about kind of the transition process. So I came from a large institution. The Field Museum has a $50 to $60 million budget. When I went to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, number one, I didn't have a medical background. Number two, it was $1 million budget, and we had $3 million worth of resources, cash flow. And then lastly is I made the change because of a personal connection. My mother passed of the disease, and I felt that it was meaningful. So when I went to the organization, again, I came in as Chief Operating Officer, but that was pretty much, I ran the organization because the CEO was in Connecticut. I would have to say that what he told me, and it was absolutely true, is you have to know what you know, and you have to know what you don't know. And very quickly I realized that right now we're a $10 million budget over the course of the last 6.5 years. What I realized was that I'm not a medical professional. I need to start building a medical team. I don't know the medical industry, and two of our largest funders are now industry partners. So I took it upon myself to start making inroads and connections with people in the field. Again, maybe term mentor is overused, but who is out in the field that could help me transition into this role? And who could I bring on my staff? We went from 5 wonderful employees, now we're up to 40. So who could help us either in a consulting role or as a full-time employee that could help us build that organization? But it was being really honest with myself and knowing what I was able to bring to the table, as well as what perhaps I didn't have experience with.
And how long do you think it took you to feel like the big chair really did belong to you?
Well, I think it was definitely at least the first year. I had to just kind of pinch myself. And I'll be completely honest, being a woman as well, I think some people, I still, in fact, experience that where, are you really the head of the organization? And I said, well, of course I am. And, in fact, last week I had somebody who said, how did you get the position? Did you marry well? And I said, well, yeah, I did marry well, but at the same point, our team has been able to do X, Y, and Z. So, I think it's not taking yourself too seriously, and that you do have a responsible role and you have a responsibility to your team. But again, know what you are confident in and what you bring to the table, as well as things that you feel like you could improve upon yourself, or surround yourself with folks who actually can complement the growth of your organization.
Thank you. This slide doesn't want to let go. All right, so we know that the traditional paths to the head of the organization have historically been several areas, but these are the ones that seem to come up a lot, because these are the ones that, frankly, as we think about heads of organizations and we work with search committees, these are the areas that they think about a lot when they look at a person's viability. And the one that will surprise no one is programs. You've come in, you've learned everything that the organization does, you're absolutely resonating with mission, you have taught everyone else what the mission has been, you've communicated it where that's been appropriate externally to the organization. Of course, there is lots of reason for you to be the head of the organization because of that. The second traditional path has been finance, simply because you understand everything about how the organization works and where all the money is, and how to really account for what the organization is doing. And the third one has been operations, particularly when there have been large, complex organizations and institutions that have lots of moving parts, and you know how all those parts move, and you work with everyone every day across the organization. So, of course, another logical choice. And that's what has been the path to the top. But when we look at what the CDO may bring, and again, I want Patty to really weigh in here. It's that in terms of programs, you've worked across the organization to understand what those are because you've needed to communicate them. You've also built, ideally, a relationship between development and finance to understand how development will impact finance, both short and long term. And also, and finally, understanding what the strategic priorities of the organizations are.
Right. To be successful in our role, we have to know all of that. And that would be in a role heading up development. So remember what I had mentioned earlier, I inadvertently had started to get a lot of experience across a foundation or across an organization that would, back to your other slide, that allowed me to dabble a little bit in programs, allowed me to understand how do we finance, or, what's the interrelationship of finance and development so that we're congruent. We want to make sure that what we're going and seeking funding for aligns with our strategic goals and strategy. And so leveraging all of that and those experiences wherever you are, and I was looking at this wonderful roster of attendees, wherever you are and what scale and scope of organization you are at, having the ability to work with your colleagues across the organization, either formally or informally, is invaluable. And that automatically gives you kind of a wealth of experience in your current role, as well as one that you certainly could use if you chose to transition into a head of an organization.
We want to turn a little bit now to what some of the challenges might be as a CDO becoming the head. And Patty and I have talked about this and thought it would be useful to hear what our perspective is from two different lenses. Mine will be working with search committees, having them think about candidates. After saying that development absolutely has to be number 1, 2, or 3, Patty's is what happens after you are in the organization and you've come as a development professional rather than from some other historic areas. Sorry, my voice is doing something weird. When we work with search committees, one of the things that we sometimes encounter is that when we see a strong development professional, he or she may be a chief development officer, their next aspiration is really to head an organization. And some of the feedback that we get is, well, they may be a really good candidate, but you know, their career has only focused on development. And so we're not sure that they really can be broad enough to be able to do that. And what's interesting about that is the other side of it is when we've had people who have gone off and done other tours, for instance, in programs or in finance, then the question becomes, well, we're not really sure that they're serious about their development career because they've wandered off and done all these other things. So can we really count on their having the focus that they need to be able to head an organization? And one of the other pieces that we find is that, and we all know this, I think, is that tenures for development can be shorter, even within development itself, but compared to areas like finance or programs or operations, they can be shorter. And so now you're almost making an unfair comparison about what kind of commitment this person may have to their own futures and to the organization's futures, frankly. And there also can be perceptions that there is less understanding of what programmatically the organization does. Development is off by themselves. We never see them. They're out having dinner parties and they're raising money and having a great time, and we're all here slogging away making sure that the mission works. And so sometimes we can spin on that because you have to make a slight adjustment about how you think about candidates if they're coming from a development perspective, but it's quite valid. It's quite valid. Patty, is there?
Yeah, you know, and listening to you and going back to the fact that when you're conducting a search, a committee, one of the top 3 objectives is to have somebody who has some experience with fundraising. Mm-hmm. I think those of us who are responsible for a fundraising unit, let's say, we have to know what our strategy is. We have to know how that aligns with our budget. We have to know how that aligns with our mission. We manage a team, whether that's 1 or 15 or 50. So we have all of the expertise of managing that team, keeping them motivated, working with HR as appropriate. We have to work with the program area, whether they're a curator or artistic director, whatever the case may be. We have to understand what they're doing so that we can make sure that we're supporting them. So in many regards, heading up a development area is kind of a mini experience that will absolutely parlay into moving into a CEO role. I think from a cultural perspective, it's making sure that those who are looking for that CEO understand the value of that mini unit that we have experienced through raising money as the head of a development organization. And so, Marion and I spoke about this earlier. It's kind of assessing what is the culture that you're moving into once you head it. Who are the decision makers? Are they aligned and open to the fact that there is a value that we're providing as somebody who has development experience? And will they be a constant? And will they be an influencer who will support you once you get into that role?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How interesting. this wasn't the way this worked in rehearsal. Anyway, let's address the challenge though, because will you talk, Patty, about being a little more about being the external face of the organization and being able to demonstrate the breadth? And you were fortunate in that you had an opportunity in your career to actually have those kind of experiences. But for someone who is aspiring to be the CEO and has these kind of broad experiences yet, what do you advise?
Maybe let's start out if we are in a development role right now. Many of us are very adept at putting together talking points, briefings. Mm-hmm. We coach, we prepare, whether they're board, whether our head of our organization. We have a big picture, and we're almost a campaign manager of sorts, whether it is for a capital campaign or it is managing our objectives. We know what our end game is, and we're trying to coach our team to try to get there. I think remembering that once we're in that CEO role, there's more visibility whether you are on a radio interview or you're going to a major gift ask. You have that experience so that hopefully you have a wonderful team that you have built that can help support you, but you also know what to expect and how you can best serve in that role as that external face. So I think taking advantage of as many of those opportunities, not just to coach and to mentor and to manage up, shall we say, develop those relationships, because that will absolutely be of benefit as you move into a head of an organization, because there's just many more, but at the same time, they're also more selective. Who you meet with, you don't have as much time, and so who you meet with is going to be of ultimate priority, as well as, you have to still prep your board, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're in that CEO role, how do you have your team who's on your staff, but also the board? How do you still help coach them so that you're all moving in the same direction?
Yeah, I want to follow on the prepping the CEO board and talk about another relationship that happens there, and that's the one where you go from perhaps being the board liaison because you were the head of development to the board now being your boss. Right. So what can you let us know about that?
Well, I think in any role, it can always be a hot seat, right? There's never enough money. Are we printing money in the back? When is it coming in? So that kind of pressure never really changes. What does change is when you're in a CEO role, a lot of what I do for my team is I buffer, and I still have to manage up. I still have to work with the board and make sure that we have realistic expectations that align with our plan, align with our mission, and align with our budget. And so that is my responsibility as head of an organization, where I might have had glimpses of that as the head of development, but that is one of my primary roles as head of an organization. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So overall, I think we're pretty familiar with what the CEO responsibilities are. And so that will not be new information, but what may be new here is hopefully what you're beginning to sense is that there's a lot of room for those of you who are development focused to really think about what it would be to head an organization, the kind of responsibilities and the kind of experiences that will make you more attractive. And that there may be experiences that you have already had that make you attractive that you may not have pulled out yet. I think maybe we should have had an interesting poll question of how many of you have actually interviewed to be a CEO, weren't chosen, and perhaps it had to do with how much development experience you were perceived to have had relative to other experience. I just think that's an interesting one to perhaps think about. But as we come sort of to the end of the formal part of our talk, we have some things that we think might be helpful for you as you think about moving to be the president, the executive director, the CEO of an organization. And of course, the first one is to be a great fundraiser, to be great at the job that you're doing now, and to broaden the experiences that you have. and to look for the intersections or entry points or transfer points between CDO and CEO that really can make you effective as a CEO and attractive to the search committee that will ultimately choose you.
You know, it was interesting. I was thinking, Marion, of this this current search that I just went through for my new position. I think what was attractive is, yes, I could be the external face. I've had that experience. Yes, I certainly could raise contributed income, but understanding how to communicate and being candid in an appropriate fashion with whether it was the board or the team, I think that that is extremely important. I also think that, again, just being honest with yourself. I mean, I wanted to gain as much experience as possible. Maybe earlier in my career, I wasn't sure that this is something that I wanted to move into, but I think having that experience in a variety of different ways. So if you're raising money through a contributed source, you might have a partner who could also bring money to the table through a marketing partnership or fee for service. Just looking at things in a creative fashion that will support you as an individual and ultimately you and your team to be successful.
We want to be able to have room for questions, but Patty, if you don't mind, I have one last one for you, and that is, when you became the CEO the first time, what do you believe was a stumble that all new CEOs might make having been a CDO? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's something that you just would give as advice.
Yeah. Well, again, I think we have to be self-reflective. And we are not going to know everything, and we're going to make mistakes. And I think in and of itself, being somebody who can understand that they're going to make mistakes, I think that is absolute necessity. We had a couple of situations where we were growing so rapidly. A lot of the financial contributions, whether they were earned or contributed coming to us, were handled by me. And I needed to learn to delegate those relationships and transition them in an appropriate way so both the partner understood as well as the team member. And I think, again, we grew so fast we didn't have the appropriate process in place. So I think if we were going to do it again, perhaps we would have brought in a finance team member or an IT member who could have supported that. So everybody was clear on messaging, clear on intent, and delivery. So, you know, did we fix it? Of course, we fixed it. But I think realizing that it's more than just you, and at some point you are responsible for the success of the organization, and it's not just raising the money, which is kind of my comfort zone.
So that's a really good example, though, of having broad experiences, because they'll help you think about who your real team is once you are the head. Right,
right. Because we will never get away from it. We love raising money, however, and whatever our mission is. And that will always be a responsibility when you're head of the organization. But we have to be able to rely on others, whether they're in finance or IT or programs, because they will round out what we're trying to do to fulfill the mission of an organization.
Okay. So we have time for some questions.
And we do have a number of questions. So first is that you all mentioned you mentioned that there's short tenure as a challenge for a CDO. And just some clarity around that. If you're referencing or referring to, is it a short tenure in the field or a short time working at each organization? Sort of a simple question there.
Yeah.
But not.
I'll take a stab since I see them. And you know, I am not at all bothered when I see someone's resume and their work and they've been with an organization, say, 3 years. The search committees can be, because they think that that's a short tenure. And if you have 3 organizations and you've been with them somewhere between 2 and 4 years, then the question inevitably comes, are they hopping? And we have to make the case, no, they probably are not. and we have to remind them of what the industry looks like and what the tenures are.
I think that's part of also managing up, so to speak, whether it's that search committee. It's back to who are the decision makers and how familiar are they with what we try to do as development professionals.
Great, thank you. A question came in directed to you, Patty. If you would speak to the transition of reporting to a single person to multiple people, challenges of managing multiple bosses, particularly if it's a large board of directors.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that I took advantage of when I was heading up development was that, of course, I reported to the head of the organization or the university, whatnot. But I still had to work very closely with other colleagues at the senior level. And so my direct performance was evaluated by that head of the organization, but I still had to make sure that other people were properly briefed, or that I was listening to them in order to be able to be successful from a fundraising perspective. So little did I know how important that would actually be, because now that I am responsible to a board, I still work closely with the chair of the board. However, I need to work very closely with the head of the development committee, or I need to work very closely with our treasurer. And I think one of the biggest things that I have been learning is that these board members don't necessarily talk to each other. And so how do you make sure that you are appropriately briefing and working with, let's say, the chair of your board, but working at a communication mechanism or even path forward so that all the decision makers who are on the board, whether it's development or treasurer, know what there's to do. So what I ended up doing is I actually have a monthly newsletter that comes out from the desk of the CEO. It's accompanied by our financials that go on a monthly basis. It's also accompanied by a scorecard, very high level of how we're doing against our strategic plan. So that if, let's say, certain board members aren't the best of friends, at least they all have the same information that comes to them all at once.
I love it. It's a great question, and certainly
it is a great question.
Yeah. I think this is another wonderful question. I am currently on the trajectory and working more now on programs, IT, operations, and finance. So this is a reinforcement that this person is on track. Does this person, or should this person, serve many or multiple years in this space, or enough to just get a solid foundation and understanding? So what's your recommendation beyond the other areas other than the CDO?
Well, for example, right now I think, during my transition from PFF to the Joe, we did not have a firm transition or succession plan in place like I had hoped for. And so when I'm going to move out in the next few weeks, our COO, who actually was our CFO, will be the interim CEO. And his background is in finance and IT. And I think that while he doesn't have the external face or connections, we have other folks on, let's say, our medical team who are helping with that. And his strong suit is he understands the strategic plan, he understands what revenue is needed and how we're going to steward that appropriately. And I think that having as much exposure to the big picture in whatever role we are will do wonders as we kind of move up in the trajectory to head an organization.
Great, thank you. This is regarding public speaking and how much public speaking experience is generally expected. Any recommendations for preparation for development leaders?
Yes, if you don't mind, and then I'll kick it back to you, Mary. Bless you. When I was head of development back at the School of the Art Institute, we had a situation where we had a couple people who were not able to come at certain times. And what we would do is we would be all media coached. I don't know how many of you have had that opportunity. But if we had to step in, even though the head of the organization normally would, We were media coached so that we all had a consistent messaging platform, and we could deliver the message in a way that would be unified. Now, right now, in my current CEO role, I have been on TV, I've been on sports radio, depending on who our donor is, and I have a wonderful team who briefs me. And so they will provide talking points, they'll tell me a little bit about what I'm doing, and then they will rehearse with me. Because even the best public speaker, it's a little nerve-wracking if you don't know the environment that you're walking into. So that will be part of your job, whether you're heading up development or you're heading up an organization. And the more comfortable you can get with talking points and having a coach or somebody who will provide feedback, I think that's invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
And even before the person is in the role, one of the things that is increasingly part of the search process itself is some type of formal presentation to the board or to the search committee or to others that really show your ability to speak and present. It's done in both a formal way as well as an informal way, where you may be meeting with people for about an hour just to talk through who you are and what you're doing. And very much it's part of the interview process and is really measuring how effective you would be or how you would represent the organization.
Or with different audiences too. With the new role I'm going into, I met with students, I met with faculty, I met with board. So it's realizing that yes, as a CEO or head of an organization, you will be dealing with the board, but you have a whole different level of audiences that you're going to have to address in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of questions, so we're going to do our best to get to as many as possible, and if we don't get to your question, we will certainly circle back. But what are the biggest struggles you see when moving from a CDO at a small organization to thinking about a CE role at a larger organization? Do you feel as a first step on the path from CDO to CEO that you should first look to be part of an org with a bigger budget?
Yes, but it's not that simple. One of the things that happens when you are looking to be the head of an organization, or even if you're looking to be CDO of a larger one, is scale. So it is difficult to go from being, say, the head of fundraising for a $5 million organization to now even being the head of fundraising for a $25 million organization, and that also applies to the CEO. So there needs to be some kind of transitioning, bridging experience that gives you large-scale credibility, but it's going to be a challenge. And it goes to the complexity, the perceived complexity of the organization itself.
Yeah, in fact, that's a fantastic question, Marion and I were, just before we started. I found that it was much easier going from, this sounds a bit crass, a brand name, let's say an art institute or a field museum that had a lot of resources, to an organization that perhaps didn't have as much, like the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. I think even with the experience that I have heading an organization or being in charge of development, it still might be challenging for me to move to a rather large organization unless we had, again, decision makers who were willing to understand that we do have a wealth of opportunity and experience that we're bringing, including building. So it's what could you do within your own program, and what could you speak to that you have built or sustained or enacted that would translate into a larger capacity with an organization that had resources.
And I think we need to speak a little bit to what the opposite is. Going from a very large to a very small is the piece of, are you willing or can you roll up your sleeves and do what needs to be done to help that organization grow? And that is also some of the feedback that search committees will give about people who are coming from brands into ones that need to be established.
Absolutely. Very good point.
Excellent. This person asked, I would like to reach CEO in my current organization. I have worked with my peer VPs for 10 plus years, some of whom may have similar aspirations. Any suggestions for navigating those waters?
Are you taking that one?
Yes.
Okay. I see you percolating. I know.
No.
We'll unpack it, as they say.
Yeah, but there's so many pieces to that question.
Yeah.
Offline, I would encourage you to email. But starting, if there are lots of you, because part of it is, and I say this, it's hard to be a prophet at home. And so if you're aspiring to be the CEO of the organization, we go back to making sure that you have the kind of experiences that will warrant that and the kind of accomplishments. And I would say even more so than perhaps your peers that will want that position outside the organization. Because inside the organization, not only do your accomplishments shine, but also your stumbles. And so while I think that you probably have a perfectly reasonable chance of doing it, you should expect that there will probably be a search that accompanies it to make sure that you are the right person.
And I think, and I wish we could have an exchange on this, I think another thing to pay attention to is how willing has the organization been to address the issues of transition and succession planning, and then ultimately who is or who would be the decision maker for something like that. Very good question, and lots that has to be considered.
There's a lot to that question, and there are a lot of moving pieces to it, and will continue to be so, particularly since you said that your peers are also aspiring to that position.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Another question, how do you overcome the challenge of getting search firms to consider you for CEO roles versus putting you in the bucket of fundraising only? That would be a Marion question.
That would be a Marion question. Well, when we are working with searches for heads and your whole background has been development, we really are going to ask you about the kinds of developmental experiences that would make you be a viable candidate for the CEO. But I think you have to, and this is where I think you have to unpack your own experiences so that you have what I call the transfer points of saying what have been the committee work that you've done, the other kinds of experiences, the tours outside development that make you broad. Because what the search committee is looking for is someone who can really be the CEO but bring their CDO chops with them. And not when they run into what they perceive as a challenge, they revert back to their CDO-ness and are not able to move the organization strategically. Because that's really what the search committee is worrying about. But really make sure that your experience includes more than what you've done as a fundraiser.
Stress management and sometimes it's conflict management and being able to, your work with the board, your work with external face. But I think you're absolutely right. May I also just quickly stress back to somebody else's question, if you are in development and you do a lot of project management, I think it's important to stress that you're able to navigate across an organization, to work with people to fulfill on goals and mission. I think that's very critical, and I've had some circumstances with that too. But your ability to navigate an organization, show leadership, direction, and fulfillment, I think that's key.
All right, well, why don't we take one final question, and this question is around culture, which I'm definitely interested in. So how do you change the culture of an organization once in the head leadership role, board, staff, protocols, existing volunteers, community development? So Patty.
Yes. Well, remember how I said the first year was a challenge. But what I did was I started to listen. I almost went on a listening tour or a campaign. I heard from a number of staff, volunteers, donors. I wanted to hear what they had to say about what the current perception or observation of the organization was. I've seen a lot of people come in, we may know a few, who just come in and boom, everything is changing. And that might change in the short term, but in the long term, it will not have that staying power. It just won't be long-term viability. So I've had success in kind of changing organizations by listening and then trying to reposition that what we're doing is aspirational, but we're achieving X, Y, and Z because of all the good work that you have done to get us to this point.
Patty, any last thoughts?
Well, I certainly hope that we can continue this conversation, whether we're...
There's certainly a lot of interest.
Absolutely.
So there are a number of more questions that we have to get to.
Okay.
And so for those of you that did submit questions that we were not able to get to, we will make sure to respond accordingly.
Mm-hmm. We are delighted that you were with us today and for all of the questions, which tells us that we are in a good place. We're going on the road. We will be presenting this at AFP International at the end of April in San Francisco. So if some of you are planning to be there, look for us to present this in an expanded version. We'll have more time to be able to do this. In the meantime, if you do have questions, please be in touch with either one of us by phone or by email. We're happy to talk more about this. And just thank you very much for our conversation today. We are delighted to have been able to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.